Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to join you here today. The theme of my talk is the global struggle for LGBT human rights. I'm sure you're all familiar that in many Western countries, in fact in most Western countries, there has been huge progress towards LGBT equality in the last 3 and 4 decades. But the global picture is much more bleak. We still have a situation where over 70 countries still have a total prohibition on same-sex relations, with nearly half of them explicitly criminalizing both sexual relations between men and sexual relations between women. So that 70+ countries amounts to close to 1/3 of all the countries in the world. 193 countries, of those over 70 have a total criminalization of homosexuality. And the penalties range from just a few years imprisonment right up to life imprisonment, and in a handful of Muslim majority countries, the death penalty for loving and having sex with a person of the same gender. So globally, the picture is pretty bleak for hundreds of millions of LGBT people. They have no recognition of their human rights. They have no protection. In fact, they face criminalization and sanction. What's interesting and perhaps shocking is that even until today, there is no international human rights convention that explicitly recognizes that LGBT rights are human rights. So in the major international human rights conventions, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and so on, none of these explicitly state that there is protection and equal treatment, or should be protection and equal treatment, on the grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity. What has happened is slowly and gradually those international human rights instruments have been interpreted to protect LGBT people. So, for example, the clauses which state everyone is entitled to equal treatment, everyone is entitled to protection against discrimination, they have in only the last 2 decades been interpreted to include LGBT people. It means that the battle on a global scale has been very patchy and long delayed. We've had in the last few years a series of resolutions in the United Nations Human Rights Council condemning discrimination and violence against LGBT people. That's great. But only this week we've got attempts in the United Nations Human Rights Council to block the appointment of a UN expert on LGBT rights. So it is a very contentious issue and still grounds for much contention. The first significant, or really significant, United Nations venture on this issue was way back in 1994, when a Tasmanian gay man, there's a gay man from the Australian state of Tasmania, took a case to what was then the United Nations Human Rights Committee to argue that the criminalization of homosexuality in Tasmania, with a penalty of 21 years imprisonment, was a violation of human rights. And to its great credit, the UN Human Rights Committee ruled that yes, it was, that this was a violation, this criminalization, this legal penalty was a violation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So that was the first UN significant initiative to defend LGBT communities. Then we had in 2008, the UN General Assembly was presented with a declaration, a statement, which likewise spoke against the criminalization, discrimination, and violence affecting LGBT people worldwide. That was presented to the UN General Assembly and was signed by 67 member states. You know, a very significant minority out of 193, but 67 signed it. It was the first time the issue of LGBT human rights had ever been presented to the UN General Assembly. So that was a real milestone. Right now, we've had, in the last 5 years, I think 3 different resolutions in the UN Human Rights Council endorsing and supporting the principle of LGBT human rights. But that is still very much a minority view within the United Nations membership. Still only a fairly small, about 1/3 of UN member states take that stance and that position. As many of you will know, Britain is a member of the Commonwealth, indeed the founder of the Commonwealth, which is a free association of nations, most of which were former British colonies in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. The Commonwealth is committed to human rights, equality, non-discrimination, and personal freedom. Yet 37 out of the 53 member states still have a total criminalization of same-sex relations. So that goes completely against the principles of the Commonwealth enshrined in its charter, which every Commonwealth member state is supposed to adhere to. Those 37 member states in the Commonwealth comprise over half of all the 70+ countries in the world that still criminalize same-sex relations. So we have a situation where a Commonwealth country like Trinidad and Tobago has a maximum penalty of 25 years imprisonment for same-sex relations. Malaysia has a maximum penalty of 20 years plus flogging. And there's life imprisonment in 7 Commonwealth countries, including Uganda, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Guyana, Sierra Leone, and Tanzania. That's pretty severe. But in 2 Commonwealth countries, Nigeria and Pakistan, in parts of those 2 Commonwealth countries, gay people can be put to death in the Muslim majority areas which have Sharia law. In all of its 6 decades of existence, the Commonwealth has never once ever discussed LGBT human rights issues. In fact, in the 25 to 30 years that I've been involved in lobbying the Commonwealth, they've explicitly refused. They will not even discuss the issue. So for the hundreds of millions of LGBT people in the Commonwealth, we can't even get our persecution discussed, let alone condemned, by the Commonwealth. Indeed, the Commonwealth General Secretary only spoke out in very mild language against homophobic, biphobic and transphobic persecution in 2011. That was the first time any Commonwealth Secretary General had ever spoken out on these issues. And that was only because I wrote a piece in the Guardian newspaper highlighting the massive scale of anti-LGBT persecution in the Commonwealth. And it created such an uproar and embarrassment that the Secretary General felt obliged to speak out. And he has 3 or 4 times since repeated that. But we don't see any drive, any real leadership for LGBT rights within the Commonwealth. In contrast, at the United Nations, the 2 Secretary Generals, Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon, have very strongly spoken out against the persecution of LGBT people. Despite the lack of majority support within the UN, they have spoken out, to their great credit, against the discrimination and other forms of persecution and oppression suffered by LGBT people. So there is leadership, but it's sometimes weak, and it certainly isn't across the board. When we look at the current scenario, we see that although there are emerging LGBT movements in every country in the world, many of them clandestine and underground, secret, because they would face imprisonment if they were discovered. But there is that movement, that grassroots movement. And in many unlikely countries, we have seen the emergence of very vocal and courageous LGBT movements. So, for example, in Honduras, despite the mass killing of LGBT people by death squads, I think in the last 5 years, over 235 LGBT activists have been assassinated by death squads in Honduras. Not LGBT people, but activists, known activists, over 235 in the last 5 years or so. But these people still organize, still protest, still campaign, and still march, despite this scale of discrimination and indeed outright violent homophobia. The emergence of these movements, particularly in repressive homophobic countries, has sadly provoked a backlash. There is a really serious backlash going on in about 15 to 20 countries. It isn't just that things are continuing to be bad, it's actually they're getting worse. And these countries include Russia, Morocco, Cameroon, Syria, Uganda, Egypt, Azerbaijan, Nigeria, Brunei, India, Chad, Zambia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Gambia, Burundi, Malaysia, Iraq, and Ethiopia. Did I miss any? I mean, it is truly, truly shocking. I mentioned Brunei, a member of the Commonwealth. 2 years ago, it introduced a very harsh version of Sharia law, which allows for the stoning to death of women who have sex outside of marriage and of LGBT people. Ethiopia, which had no tradition of homophobic persecution, has ratcheted up very severe persecution indeed, with police raids, arrests, imprisonments, and mob violence. So all these countries I mentioned have either passed new anti-gay laws, like the law that was passed in Russia in 2013, or they have reversed decriminalization, as happened in India, or they've enforced existing laws with renewed vigor. Some countries embody extreme contradictions. There are death squads that target LGBT people for so-called, quote, social cleansing in Brazil and Mexico. Yet same-sex marriage is legal in Brazil. All the major cities and the major states in Brazil have laws that protect LGBT people against discrimination in the workplace, housing, and the provision of goods and services. The same in Mexico. Mexico City recognizes same-sex marriage. Lots of parts of Mexico have anti-discrimination protections. Yet in both countries, right-wing death squads target LGBT people for assassination. A couple of years ago, the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, now renamed Outright International, produced a damning report on the intensified repression of LGBT people in Iraq since the war in 2003. They cited examples of Shia Islamist death squads going out and targeting known or suspected LGBT people, shooting them dead in their homes, in the street, or at their workplace. Other extreme punishments have been meted out. For example, arresting an LGBT person, force-feeding them laxatives, and then sealing up their anus with superglue, so that what actually happens is they physically explode. This is an extreme form of torture, and this has been done by death squads, some of which are linked or have been linked to the Iraqi government installed by the US coalition after the Iraq War. Some of the murders were being orchestrated from Iraqi government ministries which were being backed and endorsed by the US, Britain, and other coalition. As you all know, in Syria today, the Islamic State pursues a policy of arresting and executing gay and bisexual men. Interestingly, as far as we know, no lesbians have been killed, but they probably would if they could find them. As you know, they've probably been mostly, or they have mostly been killing those people by throwing them from tall buildings, and when they don't die that way, then they are stoned to death. We've had a big legal battle in Singapore, where there's been a High Court case to overturn the ban on homosexuality, which was passed by the British colonial administration in the 19th century when Britain was the occupying power, and that law has been retained ever since Singapore became independent. Sadly, Singapore decided against decriminalisation. The High Court ruled in favour of maintaining the ban. So it's easy to feel depressed and disheartened given this backlash. And, you know, understandably people feel pessimistic because, you know, we like to think that, you know, although progress may be slow, it's going forward, not backward. But of course, the important thing to bear in mind is that even in this countries where there is a backlash, they represent a tiny minority. As I said, about 15 or 20 countries out of 193. You could also optimistically look at backlash as, in a perverse way, a positive thing. Backlash is happening because the LGBT communities and their straight allies are making progress. It's precisely because change is being powered forward that backlash is happening. And this has been the history of every social movement down the ages. If you think about the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States in the 50s and 60s, what people often forget is that it provoked a backlash. The violent attacks upon African Americans actually increased during the Civil Rights era as a backlash against the gains that were being made by African American communities. So horrible, tragic, and undesirable though it is, backlash is a sign of progress. It shows that people seeking change, seeking human rights, are getting a reaction from people who want to keep things as they are. So overall, there's still mostly forward progress. In the last few years, we have seen the decriminalization of homosexuality in Mozambique, the Seychelles, the Pacific Island states of Nauru and Palau, northern Cyprus, the African state of Sao Tome and Principe, and Belize. So there are gains being made. In India, we have a fairly right-wing new government of the BJP under Prime Minister Modi. But even there, in that party and that government, voices have spoken out for the decriminalisation of homosexuality. Same-sex marriage has been won in recent years in Ireland, Slovenia, of course the United States, and even Pitcairn Island. For those who don't know Pitcairn Island, there was a very famous mutiny in the British Navy, and the mutiny on the Bounty, and the mutineers escaped and set up their new settlement on Pitcairn Island. There are only 48 people who live on Pitcairn Island today. But last year, the Pitcairn Island government voted for same-sex marriage. They said, as far as we know, there are no gay people, and there are certainly no gay couples on this island, but we want to support the principle that if there ever should be, they will have equal rights. So it's very, very encouraging, and of course you know, I'm sure, that long before Britain and the United States, countries like South Africa, Argentina and Uruguay legislated same-sex marriage. So it's, in some cases, has been non-Western countries that have led the way. There's now a push for same-sex marriage in Nepal, Vietnam, Cuba and Taiwan. Vietnam has repealed its ban on same-sex marriage, and there's now movement towards legislating that, although it's not entirely clear if and when that will happen. In Africa, the picture is very bleak. That is one of the main bastions of homophobia in the world today, where nearly all African countries have laws against same-sex relations. But even there, even in Africa, there is a sign of change. The African Commission on Human Rights, which is a body affiliated to the African Union, which represents all African member states, to everyone's surprise, last year issued a declaration against anti-LGBT discrimination and violence. This was a complete and total surprise and shock. But it happened, and it sent a very important signal to African countries and leaderships that the main representative body of African nations was standing for the principle of LGBT equality and non-discrimination. You will also probably remember that the Uganda government attempted to pass a new bill which threatened, among other things, the death penalty for same-sex relations. Before it actually got through Parliament, the death penalty clause was removed, but it still instituted very severe penalties for same-sex relations. That bill did go through Parliament. It was successful. It was endorsed by the President, but the courts threw it out on a technicality, namely that there had not been a quorum in Parliament when the bill had been passed. And there have been successive attempts to introduce new similar legislation, but none of them have found fruition. And that would indicate to me that things are beginning to change in Uganda. We're seeing more and more civil society organizations, not just LGBT ones, but general civil and human rights organizations, and even the main opposition party, the Forum for Democratic Change, speak out against anti-LGBT persecution. That's a really, really positive sign. We've also seen a minority of churches, of Christian organizations, speak out against the persecution of LGBT people. And Bishop Christopher Senyonjo, who was part of the Church of Uganda, which is part of the worldwide Anglican and Episcopal Communion, you may know that he spoke out for LGBT rights many years ago and was expelled from the church. They even took away his pension. But he continues to be a very vocal black African Christian bishop speaking in defense of LGBT human rights. And increasingly, other Christian pastors are beginning to rally and support him. Although things are pretty bleak in Russia, there have been the occasional victories. We saw the example where the St. Petersburg-based LGBT group Coming Out was prosecuted for promoting homosexual propaganda, and the courts threw out the case. Very surprisingly, they threw it out. The prosecution was not accepted, and they were acquitted. There's also been, amid the repression of many gay pride parades, successful pride parades held in St. Petersburg. And the last one this year, there were no arrests and no mob violence. That's a first. I went to Moscow 5 times and witnessed and suffered myself the violence of neo-Nazis and Russian Orthodox fanatics. So to get that change in St. Petersburg, that is a small glimmer of hope. Last year, I also went to Serbia to support Belgrade Pride. And that went ahead without incident. But I've got to tell you, it required 5,000 riot police and all the city centre to be completely closed to the public for that to happen. To stop ultranationalists and neo-Nazis from attacking the parade, it required 5,000 police in full riot gear. I can remember going to a gay club the night before, And I've never ever been to a club where to get into the club you have to pass through a row of 50 riot police with shields and visors and clubs to get into a venue. But that's how bad things are in Serbia, although, again, things are beginning to change. A poll this year suggested that an increasing minority of Serbian people do accept that LGBT people should not be persecuted. I mentioned earlier that in Singapore they'd failed in the courts to get homosexuality decriminalized. But despite this, there's a huge popular movement of LGBT and straight allies for LGBT equality. They have an annual pink dot protest where people turn up wearing pink and holding pink candles and forming a gigantic heart. This year, nearly 30,000 people turned out. For a tiny island state like Singapore, that is a huge number, a huge proportion of the population. So overall, I'd say that backlash is happening, but it's in a minority of countries. It's a temporary blip. Overall, the global trend is towards greater LGBT acceptance and equality. I know personally so many inspiring activists who are taking great personal risks. In Sudan, in Africa, where homosexuality is punishable by death, a handful of LGBT activists organized and set up a clandestine LGBT movement at great personal risk. And then they had the audacity or the guts to actually privately liaise with government ministers to push for the decriminalization of homosexuality and for a more positive and gay-friendly stance by police and other government agencies. That took real guts, real courage. They were risking their liberty and their lives. Sadly, somehow information about this got out, and some sectors of the state didn't like it, and so these people were threatened with arrest and even execution, and they had to all flee the country. But it shows the kind of courage we see from LGBT defenders in many, many countries. So I guess, in conclusion, I'd say that queer freedom is an unstoppable global trend. It knows no borders, it transcends all nations and all cultures, and one day we will make homophobia, biphobia and transphobia history. Because although queer freedom has been long delayed, it cannot and must not be denied. Thank you.